Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Energy and Climate Change, Are Australia and New Zealand Running in Opposite Directions? We're grateful to our moderator, Dr. Anthony Owen, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a wide range of products and services to address the needs of our members. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please use Zoom's Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window. Type your question, and we've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address them. And now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Anthony Owen, who is a recent principal fellow and the head of the Energy Economics Department at the Energy Studies Institute at the National University of Singapore. Tony, over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and welcome to this webinar, wherever you are in the world. I'm currently retired from that position Dave cited earlier, and my only title now is Emeritus Professor at University College London. I'm based in New South Wales, and our speakers today come from Seoul, Canberra, and from New Zealand. Today's webinar will focus on how our speakers anticipate future domestic climate change policies and how commitments on Australia and New Zealand will evolve following COP26, and what enabling policies will be required to ensure progress towards those goals. The speakers will also give their insights into how business interests and public perception in both countries may pressurize their respective governments into action. In this context, it should be noted that the next federal election in Australia must be held on or before the 21st of May next year. So in other words, it's only 5 months away at the maximum. For New Zealand, it's the 13th of January 2024, so it's quite some way off. So in Australia, at least, one can expect some interesting climate change policy discussions by the respective parties over the next few months. It's also worth noting that both countries have employed the tightest COVID pandemic restrictions of any OECD nations. And politically, this issue has tended until now to largely overshadow developments in climate change policies and commitments. I'll now introduce today's speakers very briefly, because in the flyer for this event, there's far more details about their backgrounds and their qualifications. But since all 3 individuals are well known, I'll only cover it their details very briefly. We're going to lead off with Hoesung Lee, who's chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and endowed chair professor at Korea University, Graduate School of Energy and Environment in Seoul. He will be followed by Brian Fisher, who's currently the chairman and managing director of BA Economics Proprietary Limited. He was previously the executive director of the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics, and the professor of agricultural economics and the dean of the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Sydney. And Brian speaking to us from Canberra. And he will be followed by Ralph Sims, who's Emeritus Professor of Sustainable Energy and Climate Mitigation at Massey University in Palmerston North in New Zealand. He chaired the Royal Society of New Zealand panel for the 2016 study, Transition to a Low Carbon Economy for New Zealand, and for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In fact, both Brian and Ralph have been heavily involved with various IPCC assessment reports. So without saying any more, I'd like to pass over immediately to our first speaker, Hoesung Lee. So the screen is yours, Hoesung.
Thank you, Tony. And I greet from winter in Northern Hemisphere to all of you enjoying the summer. I believe you had summer there. So I think our common interests in economics through our works with the IPCC and IAEE brought us together for this webinar. Many thanks to Dave Williams and Tony Owen for organizing this, and my colleagues in the panel for participation. I'd like to give some remarks from a global perspective, and then briefly touch on the matters related to Australia and New Zealand. First, I want to say something about the global net zero goal. And a number of countries declared CO2 net zero by 2050. The IPCC provided the science behind the global net zero in that report, the special report on the global warming 1.5 degrees released 3 years ago. The global net zero goal means a ceiling on total cumulative emissions for the next 3 decades. This cap is about 500 gigaton of CO2. The models attached to this about 50% probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And so this is a global emission ceiling, and generally known as a remaining carbon budget. You can compare this 500 gigaton of CO2 limit for the next 30 years with the current annual emission of about 40 gigaton CO2. So definitely the current emission trend is not comparable with this carbon neutrality by 2050. The emissions are directly related to infrastructure. Studies and after studies project that future emissions from the existing fossil fuel infrastructure will exceed this 500 gigaton of CO2. Net zero goal implies fossil fuel infrastructure retiring prematurely. So according to the special report 1.5, the value of carbon-based assets might decline by 38% by the mid-2030s. And the marginal cost of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, again, according to this special report on 1.5, was estimated to be about 3 to 4 times higher compared to limiting global warming to 2 degrees. This raises a question about a viability net zero for 1.5 degrees. The cost differences depend upon, obviously, assumptions about the future cost of carbon-free technologies. Many studies indicate that many studies have underestimated the speed of cost reduction of the alternative technologies. And also answer to this question depends on the potential benefits of mitigation action, that is the reduced damages from climate change. The science point out a very significant differences in impacts between now already 1.1 degree warmer and additional 0.5 degree warming, and then still additional 0.5 degree warming, reaching something close to 2 degrees in this century. Just 4 months ago, the IPCC released its latest assessment on the physical science space of climate change. There were many messages there, but it does first several, if I want to highlight, the first is the rate of warming and its consequences. They are unprecedented. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, highest, at least 2 million years. Sea level rise, fastest in at least 3,000 years. Arctic sea ice, lowest in 1,000 years. Glaciers retreat, unprecedented in 2,000 years. Ocean warming, faster over the past century, and ocean acidification, unusual in at least 2 million years. The second is the future global warming. For the next 30 years, the global warming will continue regardless of the level of emissions reductions. Obviously, this is due to inertia in the climate system, and it is 30 years after that we will see the fruit of our current effort to reduce emissions. The current trend of CO2 emissions projects a warming of about 3.3 to 5.7 degrees by the end of this century. Extreme events will become more extreme, and adaptation capability of natural and human systems will be severely limited. For instance, the coral reefs and the Arctic summer ice sea, the difference between the warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees means existence or disappearance. For insects, their role is very critical in the ecosystem function. The difference of a half a degree warming means 18% of their population affected versus 6% with this 1.5 degree less warming in terms of bioclimatic geographic range loss. Population exposed to extreme heat waves, the analysis indicates that the difference of this half-degree warming means 37% of total population affected versus 14% with half a degree of less warming. For people living in the large city areas, the difference of half a degree less warming means 351 million people will not be subject to severe drought, a decline of 85%. There are estimates of GDP loss due to climate change, but they do not include non-market risks and the risks of crossing thresholds for some systems, such as ice sheet instability in Antarctica and or irreversible loss of Greenland ice sheet, which is projected to be triggered at around 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. We noticed that poverty has increased with recent warming, which is about 1.1 degrees, and is expected to increase for many populations as warming continues, threatening health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, and of course, human security. Especially does low and middle income countries and regions, tropics and southern hemisphere subtropics, to experience the largest negative impacts on economic growth should global temperature increases passes 1.5 degrees, increasing toward 2 degrees in this century. Here I want to show you some examples, instances studied for Australia and New Zealand. Let me share my screen. I cannot find the slides. It was here before.
I may be able to put your slides up
Please.
for you.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. Yes, this shows the regions where the changes in the risk when moving from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees are particularly high. The source is a special report 1.5. And the water availability, the shifts of biomes, wildfire, ecosystem production. These are the key risks identified. And then we noticed that Australia ranks there, water availability. Australia again, shifts of biomes, Australia, wildfire. Australia again for the ecosystem production. This is a 1.5, the result of 1.5 studies, and then we will have a working group 2, the impacts and vulnerability studies released next February, and this information will be certainly updated. And can I can we show the next slide? This is the New Zealand, and the source of this data is the IPCC, the Interactive Atlas. You can get to the access through the IPCC website. And in the case of New Zealand, as this data shows, every major climate impact driver indicators, climate impact driver shows a worsening sign. The temperature up, floods up, snow down, sea level rise, coastal floods, coastal erosion, and marine heat waves and ocean lake acidification or up, not a good sign at all. So these are what's happening in the region of Australia and New Zealand. Let me go back to my, could you remove the slide? Thank you, Dave. So achieving carbon neutrality is about certainly energy transformation and sustainable agriculture. And it also is about how developing countries will grow their economy with their increasing populations. If they follow in the way that developed countries grew in the past, I think any chance for climate solution would be over. Therefore, finance, technology, provision for developing countries, for them to adopt carbon neutral development path should be the core of global cooperation to achieve global carbon neutrality. Certainly, the inertia in the systems, status quo bias, short-termism, and loss aversion stand in the way of transformation for carbon neutrality. Climate change can change this. Climate policy can change this. And I believe that the climate action will bring us a triple dividends consisting of non-climate and climate benefits, such as immediate improved air quality and jobs and clean economic growth now in the new sector, and then improved climate in the pipeline. I want to close my remark with a somewhat longer term perspective. Global economy needs another transformation from the current throughput economy system to where prosperity continues within the boundaries of the ecosystem services nature provides. Solving climate change problems will not be the end of the challenges we face regarding the resource use. Thank you for your attention, and I wish us a very productive meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Hoesung. We'll leave questions and answer session to after all three speakers have given their presentations. So we'll move on now to Brian. Brian?
Thanks very much. So perhaps what I should do first is make sure that we can share this screen, and then I can proceed from there.
Okay, click on slideshow. Play from start.
Okay, that's all coming through, is it?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. All right, so what I wanted to start off doing was to give you a little bit of background about the nature of the task of reaching net zero in Australia by 2050. So I'll start by outlining some of the trends from the past and some of the background about our emissions and the structure of our energy industries, so that everybody has a little bit of background for those people who, for those in the audience who don't know a lot about Australia. First thing I wanted to point out was that over the last 20 odd years, and especially since the GFC, we've made reasonable reductions in emissions. At least the trend is going in the right direction. There's a lot of debate about whether that trend is faster or slower than it should be, but at least it's in the right direction. Now, the lion's share of those reductions have, well, first of all, before I go on to that, this next slide shows you the makeup of our emissions in the traditional inventory sectors. Electricity is by far the most important sector in terms of emissions output in Australia, followed by stationary energy and transport, with agriculture also very important, and land use change in forestry is also an important sector for us, which has seen some very substantial changes over the last 25 or 30 years. This slide gives you some idea of what the trends have been in the major gases. Since the GFC, basically, the three major gases have been down. Or the industrial gases, the trend in industrial gases has been up, but the volume of those gases in Australia is small compared, for example, to CO2 and emissions from the major sectors like electricity. This next slide gives you some idea of what the Australian government official projections are in terms of primary energy consumption. You'll notice there that as far as coal is concerned, the official projections have very substantial reductions in coal use in Australia, but oil and gas have either been trending up or flat, and are flat or not doing very much in terms of change in the forecast period. So basically what that's suggesting is that we have some pretty sticky sectors in terms of emissions reductions, and most of what we've done to date has come from transformation of the electricity sector with the introduction of substantial and growing penetration of renewables in that sector. Both the Liberal National Coalition, the party that's in government at the moment, and the Alternative Labor government have adopted a 2050 net zero target. I guess what's more important in the short term, at least, is what's happening with respect to the debate over the 2030 target. The coalition government has not altered its 2030 target, which is 26 to 28% reduction on a 2005 base year. But they are relying on current emissions projections to state that they will achieve at least a 30% reduction and perhaps a 35% reduction on a 2005 base by 2030. The argument they're using is that they went to the last election with a promise to maintain the then Paris commitment of 26 to 28%. They believe that they will beat that target, but they're not inclined from a political point of view to change the target at present. The Labor opposition has just announced a 43% reduction target for 2030 from a 2005 base. And when you look at the projections, there's really not a lot of difference between the 43% reduction target that's been announced by the Labor opposition and what's embedded in the official government projections out to 2030. So I think the real difference in policy that has been discussed here is the coalition government has adopted a three-word statement which says technology, not taxes, basically. So they are very shy about talking about carbon taxes or carbon prices, and are relying on driving technology development as the main means of hitting short and long-term targets. The Labor opposition, on the other hand, have released some short-term modelling out to 2030, and that modelling contains some information about the electricity sector out to 2040, and they have announced a more traditional approach to policy, including a baseline and credit trading scheme, which the mechanisms for that are already in legislation. They don't, if they were to be returned to government in the early part of next year, they can probably implement that scheme without much trouble, basically. They're also talking about new infrastructure spending and incentives to increase the penetration of electric vehicles in the transport sector. In other words, tackling that rather difficult transport sector we have, where we've seen virtually no action in terms of emissions reduction over the last 20 odd years. And as you've already heard, the outcome, the next federal election must happen before the end of May 2022, and it's going to be the outcome of that election is going to be critical in determining the short-term policy approach. I just wanted to illustrate with this slide that the main reductions that are projected by the government at present are in the electricity sector. And if you accept the government's projections as they are, by 2030, we will see 61% of total electricity generation in Australia coming from renewables, and that's up from 21% in 2019. Now that's being driven by a massive increase in small and medium scale solar, together with large projects in both solar and wind. And the sort of transformation we're talking about here is very, very substantial. And there has to be some doubt about whether we're going to see that sort of penetration of renewables in the system over the next 8 years, particularly given that we've been slow in increasing expenditure on new transmission, and that construction projects in Australia tend to lag in terms of their delivery times quite a lot. One of the things that isn't talked about very much in terms of the contribution to emissions reduction in Australia is land use change in forestry. And this has made this sector has made a very substantial contribution to reduction since 2005. And the projections suggest that it's going to contribute negative emissions, or basically a sink, over the next 10 years. And if you have a look at the government's official 2050 modelling, it suggests that the land use change and forestry sector will contribute very substantially to offsets as a part of reaching the net zero target by 2050. And that brings me to the point that to probably, no matter who's in power on the run up to 2050, to achieve a net zero target in Australia, we're going to be reliant on some sort of offsets, whether they be domestic or international. And this suggests, of course, that we're talking about, at least implicitly, some sort of emissions trading scheme. Now, at the moment, neither the Coalition or the Labor Party wants to talk about carbon prices and particularly carbon taxes, because they've both been politically burnt by those concepts and terms. So we have this rather bizarre situation where implicit in the policies of both competing governments, there's an emissions trading scheme lurking in the background, but nobody wants to talk about it, which is going to make the implementation of that sort of policy pretty difficult if we don't have some sort of sensible debate. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the coalition government's approach is described by technology, not taxes, and they're really appealing to those in Australia who produce or support the producers of the majority of Australia's exports. Those the miners and the farmers and those who support them are consciously or unconsciously mercantilists. As you probably know, people that have that view seem to think that a dollar's value of an export good is intrinsically worth more than a dollar's value of domestically produced goods. And that is sort of basically, that appeal has deep-rooted political appeal in Australia, and the coalition government is basically talking to that audience. In the case of the Labor Party, they're faced with a situation where they have to balance the interests in their traditional inner city seats with those of workers in regional Australia. And that's a very, very difficult situation for both, for the Labor Party in particular, because basically their voting base has been eroded by the Greens, similar in some senses to the way the coalition's voting base has been being eroded by those who are to the right of the coalition in some of the more fringe parties. And I think the outcome of this battle that we're about to see is likely to be more independence in the federal parliament, and as a consequence of that, further instability in Australia's climate policy. If we remember back to what happened following the win of the Rudd Labor government in 2007 in Australia, we basically, during that period, the Rudd-Gillard government introduced effectively, or attempted to introduce, an emissions trading scheme, which turned into effectively a carbon tax, and that was used relentlessly by the then opposition to undermine that government, and with a subsequent loss of power by the Labor Party in 2013. Now, the consequence of that has been that we've swung from more traditional approaches to policy and climate to some other set of approaches, and we face the prospect that we're entering this cycle again, particularly if we see an increased mix of independents in the federal parliament. So I think the challenge we face really is attempting to bring more rationality to this debate with less political vitriol, if that's ever possible. And thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. And now we'll pass on to Ralph. The screen is yours, Ralph.
Okay, kia ora. It's good to be here. I have to say, Tony, I'm an engineer, not an economist. And when I got the request from you from IAEE, I thought that meant energy efficiency or energy engineering or whatever. But I understand, or I've actually checked, that Jeff Bertram's on the participant list. And he's, of course, an economist in New Zealand that many of you know. So, Jeff, don't ask me any hard questions, but if I can't answer any, I could pass them on to you if that's all right. So I'm going to share my screen. If I can just get back to, sorry, how did I do that? Down here it is, sorry, wrong one there. And I'm going to share it there. And you should be able to see it now. Is that there, Tony?
Yes, excellent.
Okay. So I've called this Why New Zealand Also Received a Fossil of the Day award at COP26, because Australia, of course, got the main Fossil of the 2 weeks award, and New Zealand was pleased to be second place to Australia, which is an unusual situation, but we're not perfect. So I'm going to go through, similar to what Brian's just done, from a slightly different perspective, and explain where we're at in New Zealand. So the first slide is similar to one that Brian showed, which is the breakdown of our emissions, and electricity heat on the far side is actually relatively low because we are near 85% renewable electricity. Transport is our problem and still growing, but of course agriculture, very unusual in OECD countries, if not unique, is about nearly half of our emissions, and that's our big challenge. On the right-hand side, just the same as in Brian's slide, we got LULUCF, or forest and land use, and some emission reductions there by carbon dioxide removals, which I'll come on to shortly. But if we then take the heat and the electricity and we allocate that to the various sectors, then you can see where and there's a bit on transport for electricity, but buildings and industry, of course, come up a little bit. But basically, transport and agriculture are our key challenges, and our transport emissions continue to rise. So our total, just from the last data available, and I'll use these numbers going forward, 82.3 million tonnes gross emissions, less the forest sinks, brings it down to about 54.9 million tonnes CO2 equivalent. And so, like I said, 85% renewable electricity, and that has got a target of increasing out to 100%, although we think we don't need to go to 100%. It's maybe too much of a challenge to get reliability and affordability, etc. But we've got a wind farm just up the road from me, just 3 kilometres. I can look out my window, and we've got a new 60 megawatt wind farm. Palmerston North is one of the windiest places in New Zealand, if not in the world. So none of our renewable electricity gets any subsidies. So one of our wind turbines here in Palmerston North, if you took it and put it into North America or down Germany or Denmark, where they originate from, they'd only generate about a third of the power, simply because we're a much more windy country. So we're quite proud of that. Wind is about 7% of total electricity generation and rising, and geothermal is about 15%. And of course, hydro is the significant 60% or so. But we do have problems in a dry year when the hydro lakes are down. So if we look at our gross emissions since 1990 and our net emissions, this is the accounting method that's put through to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change on an annual basis. And the last numbers, as I just said, were 82.3 gross and 54.9 net due to our forest removals. We do have a large area of Pinus radiata, in particular exotics, but also some native plantations, and also some areas that are fenced off, and the native trees regenerate naturally, and there's a carbon credit possible to claim there. If we look at our nationally determined contribution, which from the Paris commitment, it was 30% below 2005, and it was it's the gross net accounting. So if we're looking at net there, you can see there's actually not much reduction in where we are now. So it's down to this point here from gross, but it's measured as net. If we then go to our second NDC, which the government announced 2 days before the Glasgow COP started, because obviously they felt as though they might get the Fossil of the Day award before they even got there, then that was reduced down to 50% below 2005, down to 41.3 million tonnes CO2 equivalent net. And so that's much more on track with our 2050 target of net zero emissions. For CO2, long-lived gases, it excludes biogenic methane, which I'll come back to shortly. So we do have a zero carbon act, and this target is built into that act. So to meet our emissions, following on from the COP, where there's been finally an agreement on Article 6 from Paris on international offsets and trading, etc., our NDC will be met by a combination of purchasing carbon credits on the international market, CO2 removals by more forests, exotics and natives, and reducing domestic emissions. But the interesting thing here is that, and I haven't certainly seen any analysis or data, I don't know if it's in the public domain, but when the government announced the second NDC, 2/3 of that emission reduction will come from purchasing carbon credits offshore, 2/3. And of course, that's caused a lot of controversy, because people have said, well, gee, if that's going to cost us $5 billion or $6 billion, why don't we invest that on our own domestic reductions? So this is still up for debate, but that's where that was where it was heading going into the Glasgow COP. We, unlike Australia, we do have an emissions trading scheme, and it's encouraging market forces to drive behavioural change and indeed afforestation. And this is to show that the unit prices since its instigation in around 2010 have certainly been up and down. So 2012 to 15 or so was meaningless, really. And we were buying hot air credits from Ukraine, and all sorts of nonsense was going on like that. But finally, it's got somewhere, and that we're up to now, about today, in fact, is $68.15 New Zealand cents, which is about 60 Australian dollars a tonne. And so it's starting to have an impact, and people are obviously taking note of where those price rises might go into the future. So it requires businesses to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, which is a good thing. Businesses buy emission units at auction, have to put in 1 New Zealand unit to the government for each 1 tonne of emissions that they emit. Many of you know how these things work, I'm sure. Limited to the number of NZUs available that are supplied into the scheme. sectors covered are transport, domestic aviation, industry, waste, electricity, forest. I don't know about the rest of you, but because the photographs of the speakers is on the right-hand side of the screen, I can't read all my own work here, but that's just the way that the thing's set up. So I've left out a sector, which I can't remember what it was, but you can guess. So the industries deemed at risk from trade, e.g. steel and aluminium, are allocated free units by governments to offset the majority of their emissions, not the total amount. But this is under review, as in fact is the whole of the ETS scheme yet again. Under the previous national government, a few years ago, it was weakened. Now it's getting strengthened a bit. I should have said as well at the beginning, we have a Labour government now, and it was prior to that a Labour Greens coalition for 3 years, which worked reasonably well. And then the Greens are now, the Labour is in force, in power on its own. And but we do have a Greens leader of the Greens party, James Shaw, is the Minister for Climate Change outside of cabinet. And he did go to Glasgow. A lot of criticism in the media to say, gee, what about all your air emissions from your air travel, etc., etc. But of course, it was critical he was there. He's held in high regard. He's trying to do the best he can within a constrained political environment, really, because Greens are, like I said, outside of government now. But he's pretty well respected. And in fact, in Glasgow, he was asked to chair the transparency negotiations, for example. So it was pretty important that he was there. Agriculture is exempt from the ETS, but that is under review as well. And this is going through the process at the moment with a collaboration between the farming industry and the government. At the moment, farmers have got to measure their emissions, and they're learning how to do that. I can't remember the percentage, maybe 30 or 40% have got that far. And then further consultation how the sector can reduce emissions is in place. And that there has been some statements made, but if the industry doesn't get its act together and reduce emissions significantly over the next decade or so, or claim to, or target to, then they can be brought into the ETS. So that's an ongoing process. However, with regards to the ETS, so the agricultural sector's protesting against all sorts of things, the water reforms and the climate change policies, even though they have the most to lose, as I see it, because of the future of droughts and floods, etc. There's been several years where there have been major losses for the farms, and payments have been made. Interestingly, I spoke at Federated Farmers, which is the industry association, if you like, a few years ago, a year or two ago, and I went back a few years over their history, and they balked at the FARC tax, which Minister Pete Hodgson was trying to bring in, which was a carbon charge in 2007, I think it was. And they didn't believe Minister Pete Hodgson about climate change. He's a scientist, he's a vet from Massey University, actually, and he understood it well. But there was all these protests, we don't believe you, etc., etc. And then the next year or two, the chair of Federated Farmers said, oh, well, climate change might be happening, but we don't have to worry about it. And then a year or two later, they said, oh, well, climate change could be happening, but we can adapt and we can change our farming policies. And then another year or two later on, there was another president of the Federated Farmers. And finally, they said, gee, climate change is happening, and can we have $50 million from government for our water reservoirs because we need more irrigation? So it's been a learning curve for the agricultural community. Gross emissions have not declined after 11 years of the ETS. So you could argue that it hasn't been very successful at all. You saw the slide of gross emissions, which were fairly static over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's not really well promoted. Whenever we go into a service station and buy a litre of petrol or diesel, at the moment at the $68 price, we're paying about 15 cents a litre as a carbon levy on the fuel that we purchase. But nobody knows that. It's not on their bill, and it should. So, you know, people just aren't aware of exactly what the emissions trading scheme is. So I can't read that either because there's a thing up here on my screen. Can't stop it, sorry. So yeah, so the Climate Change Commission was formed in May 2018 under the an interim Climate Change Commission was formed in May 2018 with the knowledge that a Climate Change Commission was going to come into the legislation later on. And this reported on reaching 100% renewable electricity with the solution of not to try and get to 100%, but go to 95%. It'll be, you could spend the rest of the money doing better things, and how to reduce agricultural emissions. And that was there in place for a year before the Climate Change Commission was formed in November 2019 with 7 commissioners appointed. And a new one is being sought at the moment on because there was a gap on energy and transport. And so last I heard, they advertised for a new commissioner, or additional commissioner. So it aims to deliver evidence-based advice to government on, sorry, I can't read that word, on action and propose emission budgets for long-lived and short-lived emissions. Draft advice to government published January 2001, went out for consultation, and over 15,000 submissions were received from businesses, from individuals, from NGOs. So the final advice, after they reviewed the draft, the final advice went to government in May of this year, and is realistic, makes a clear case to government to take immediate and decisive action. So it's pretty strongly worded advice in there as to how we can reduce emissions over the next decade or two. So government has delayed taking action till May 2022 and put out another consultation document, which sort of just delays the process really. The emissions reduction plan has now gone out for consultation, it's just been closed, where it asks specifically for advice from businesses and the public how we can best reduce our emissions. And so it's a sort of delay tactic as far as I see it. But there will be a commitment for government in May 2022 to take notice of the Climate Change Commission's advice and to come up with legislative policies. The Commission provided 3 emission budgets, 2022-25, 26-30, and 31-35, which is similar to what the British Climate Change Committee did a few years ago, and has been quite successful in drawing. But it's the New Zealand one provides advice. The UK committee is a bit more proactive with government. So if we look at the long-lived CO2 and nitrous oxide gases, you can see there the 3 budgets that I just mentioned on the bottom of the slide, and the this is just for long-lived gas, and the 2050 target out to the right. So there's a trend movement towards that target. If we look at the short-lived methane targets, and I think New Zealand is one of the few countries where we've got short-lived targets separated from long-lived, then the 2030 target was 10% below 2017, and the longer range target out to 2050 is 24 to 47%, because nobody quite knows how we can achieve this, given that this is agricultural emissions, and we have got a lot of research going on, but actually how to reduce the emissions by feeding the animals, by breeding for low methane, by injecting, by genetically modifying gut bacteria, whatever. All of these things are being looked at, but they're actually only reducing a few % each. So to change the agricultural emissions really means cutting the numbers of cows and sheep. And of course, there's a lot of opposition to that concept. Here, the little X that just appears there. In Glasgow, there was the methane pledge that the US and EU put together for countries to join. And I guess New Zealand had no choice but to join the Glasgow pledge, which is 30% lower by 2030. But nobody's got a clue in New Zealand how we're going to do that. It's really, well, they had no choice, I guess, politically. And so that's our new target, and there's no way we can get there. Interestingly, the Climate Change Commission has adopted a new accounting method for net emissions. And so on the left-hand side here, is everybody else seeing these photographs on the right-hand side of the screen? I might, let me just, maybe, yeah, that's better. Yeah, sorry, I should have thought of that before. I've just reduced the screen size, that's better. Sorry about that. So this is the standard method that I showed you before in the first or second slide, and the 54.9 is the net emission figure there for 2019. But then with the modified activity-based approach, which is what you now see on the right-hand side, the net emissions has risen to 74.9 million tonnes, which means it's easier to reduce by 10% or 20%, so it looks better. The difference here is that these net emissions were from trees that were planted before 1990 that were growing actively and pulling CO2 out of the air, out of the atmosphere, whereas this system accounting method here only accounts for a tree planted in 1990, and the trees are pretty slow to grow, and they keep planting, and then finally you start to get some measurable emissions removals, and then you get a harvest going on. And so it's a different accounting method, but agreed still in principle internationally. So we've now got, partly as a result of the accounting method, but partly as a result of the Climate Change Commission being challenged about whether we're actually going to meet our 1.5 degrees C share of the obligations. The Lawyers for Climate Action has now taken the Commission and the Minister to court. This is coming up in February, claiming the advice does not comply with the Climate Change Response Act or with New Zealand's obligations under the Paris Agreement. So there's interesting developments going to be shown there in the next few months, I think. So now I'll have to do it that way. So this now shows, this was an animated diagram, so I'll have to explain what there is here. These are the three budgets here, the grey columns. The Paris NDC spread over that period from 2021 to 2030 is the blue shaded area, but the new nationally determined contribution budget over that period is the red shaded area. So in order to get down to this level here, we can't do it overnight. So it's showing the emission budgets over that period of time. So that's the challenge before us. So finally, the public and business perception we were asked to mention. So recent surveys that have been undertaken in New Zealand and by ECA, Energy Efficiency Conservation Authority, and some international ones, Coleman, whoever, 78% of New Zealand respondents think damaging temperature rises are unavoidable. Only 37 think the government has a clear plan in place, and that's probably a good assessment because we're not convinced they do have. 57% think the government should act now, and 60% of the respondents think businesses should act now. Only 62% agreed that individuals need to act now for the sake of future generations, and that was 69% in Australia and 72% globally. So New Zealanders are a bit more complacent about what they need to do. 66% think they know how to reduce their personal emissions. And most of them said, oh, we're recycling, and that's the way they're going to do it. So the higher impact options were at the bottom of their list. So only 31% thought they might try and avoid flying. Only 30% thought they might try and get out of their cars and go by bus or walk or cycle or whatever instead. And only 35% are likely to eat less meat. And there was an age difference here as well. The younger generation are more likely to eat less meat. There was a group of over 75-year-olds, which I don't quite come to, and they are going to stick to their meat. And I suppose good luck to them, because they have done for the last 75 years or 90 years. So after 3 years of existence, we've had a climate leaders coalition of over 100 major businesses, including the oil companies and the Air New Zealand, etc. And they've all grouped together with the aim of reducing their emissions. And after 3 years, they've only managed to reduce them by 7% between them. There is some changes going on. Fonterra, for example, with their milk processing, are moving away from coal, but only very slowly, into electricity, but also into biomass. Bioenergy is growing fast here now. There's a lot of opportunity there. Last couple of points. Farmers are protesting against climate policies, including the fee-based scheme. So now if we buy an electric vehicle, I've got an electric vehicle plugged in and charging off my solar panels here as we speak. But if I bought a new one, then I'd get a reduction of about $6,000 off the retail price. But then in another few months' time, if I buy a big ute or SUV, petrol or diesel, then I have to pay an extra fee for the privilege of owning that high emitting vehicle. So that's sort of halfway through in place, but the farmers don't like it. The ute tax, as they call it. So overall, there's little societal pressure on government to act with any urgency. And these are my grandchildren. This is really what it's all about as far as I see it. So rather than jumping with joy, future generations will carry the costs as a result of the planet exceeding 2 degrees C, in my view. I can't see any IPCC. I've obviously followed all the arguments, and I followed the Glasgow COP. I've been to a few COPs in my time, but I can't see any way of staying below 1.5. And so the younger generations are going to blame us all for not acting sooner. So I'll stop sharing and pass back to you, Tony.
Thanks very much, Ralph, for the family photos. Can I just encourage participants to now send in their questions, write in their questions. And what I'm going to do first of all is direct the first two, because they came up very early in Hoesung's talk. They're obviously directed to Hoesung. The first is from Kelly Burns. She said, I note Australia is listed as a country as at risk, but not New Zealand, ? And Sarah Fairhurst asked, is that nice dashboard on impacts publicly available? So can you take those two, Hoesung?
Yes, okay, that the dashboard is publicly available. That you can visit the IPCC, website, and click on the atlas. There you can find the region of your interest to see the various information about the climate changes. And with regard to the whether New Zealand was not a country at risk, the database I introduced here was the special report on 1.5, and there Australia was more or less prominently found in those risks I mentioned, shown in slide. And New Zealand, it was very interesting to see that the on the tourism sector, New Zealand was in fact mentioned, and it is one of the countries, regions, categorized as at lowest risk, along with the Western, Northern Europe, and Central Asia, and Canada, and New Zealand. And then the highest risk highest risk in the sector of tourism, be it Africa and Middle East, and South Asia, and Caribbean, and then Indian and Pacific oceans. So those are the status of the findings as of Special Report 1.5. I believe as I mentioned before, IPCC will release the second part of this regular assessment, that is the impacts and vulnerability studies. That will be next February, and I'm sure there'll be more information there.
Thanks, Hoesung. Kelly has come back with another question which applies to all members of the panel. So if you can kick off with this one, Brian, and then Ralph and Hoesung to add to it. What's the most important policy lesson Australia can learn from New Zealand in terms of decarbonising the electricity sector? You want to have a go at that, Brian?
Thanks, Tony. That's an interesting question. I think the main thing to take account of here is that New Zealand has traditionally been a country with a very, very high share of hydro and other renewable energy sources in the electricity sector, where Australia has been traditionally a coal-based electricity sector. There's a story around that one of the Swiss engineers engaged in building the Snowy Mountain hydroelectric scheme, he was reported to have said in the 1950s, "This is the most fantastic scheme in the world. It's just a pity that there isn't enough water." And that, I think that basically says it all with respect to Australia. We are limited in terms of our hydro resources very severely, and as a consequence of that, all the vast development in Australia's electricity system since the Second World War has been in coal and gas. The renewable penetration we've seen since about 2000 has been driven directly by public policy, some of it possibly actually quite expensive policy in terms of the shadow price of carbon implied by the system in the hundreds of dollars to reduce a ton of carbon. So we've done it in a very expensive way, but the trend in emissions reductions driven by the penetration of renewables in Australia is pretty incredible, really, when you look at the base of our system. The real challenge that we face now is that we're getting penetration levels that are so high in a thermal system that we need definitely need policies for firming to make sure that reliability is maintained, but we don't, and the most recent projections from our energy market operator is that we're going to see an even faster reduction in coal generators in the system. So the real challenge we face with this massive increase in penetration is exactly how we maintain firming. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that really requires an enormous amount of capital expenditure, particularly in transmission. And nobody really wants to talk about how the cost of that is going to be met.
Ralph, have you got a comment on that?
Yes, it's pretty hard to, we are so different between the two countries, as Brian's alluded to there. So it is pretty hard to get lessons across, I think. We've used more coal this year than for a long time, purely because the hydro lakes were low. And so we're sort of going in the wrong direction. And that is trying to be resolved by having a large pumped hydro scheme. Maybe the government's put $30 million into exploring how to get reliability. But what we both got the opportunity to do is the smart grids, distributed systems, and change the whole thinking through. And in fact, there was our electricity authority is checking out on this and looking at what's possible in the future. And so having electric vehicles, battery storage, solar panels, solar farms, all of those sort of things are certainly technically possible in Australia. We've already got the largest battery system down in South Australia. Batteries are coming cheaper, electric cars are coming cheaper, solar panels are getting cheaper, and you've got a lot more sunshine in Australia than we have here. And so the other point, I suppose, is bioenergy that I mentioned before. I've done work in Australia in the past decades, and there's an area there mainly for heat, but also for electricity. And there is a strong Australian Bioenergy Association, which I think is pushing hard there as well. Wind is also got potential there. There's New Zealand ownership of wind farms in Australia, but because of the vast land area compared with our little compact New Zealand, it is hard to bring these systems into place. But I think we're all looking towards. We should mention hydrogen as well. We've got a hydrogen plant just opened here yesterday, I think it was. We're aiming towards green hydrogen using renewable electricity, electrolysis. We did a project for some community 12 years ago, a rural community, where we put hydrogen from a wind turbine on the top of a hill with an electrolyzer, and we brought hydrogen down the hill because it was much cheaper than bringing electricity down in a copper cable. We have fuel cells under the old wool shed, and that was generating electricity. It worked, but it was not cost effective. But certainly there's a lot of hope and a lot of hype about hydrogen at the moment, and there will be some applications, but I'm not quite sure where they'll be. Natural gas, the other point there in New Zealand, of course, is we have got a policy, no more oil and gas exploration offshore, which was brought in 5 years ago, I think. We've still got some gas in the fields, but the Climate Change Commission has also recommended no, and this is something I've been advocating for a while, no new building should be connected to gas. It should have started last year or 10 years ago, but then that will reduce the demand ongoing. And so there's other ways of heating and cooking, etc. So there's a few ideas that are coming through. How many of them relate to the Australian situation, I'm not sure.
You've just actually, thanks for that, Ralph. You've just actually preempted the next question from Sarah Fairhurst. Any comments on either country's plans for a hydrogen economy as a way to mitigate emissions? Before I give it to you, Brian, Hoesung, do you want to say anything about hydrogen in a more general context?
Well, before I say anything about hydrogen, based upon Brian's and Ralph's intervention, I got the perception that with regard to the market-based instrument, it seemed to me, correct me if I interpret wrong, it seemed to me that New Zealand is more favorable to such instruments than Australia. And would my interpretation be on the right path?
Does somebody want to answer that?
I suppose because
just briefly reaction. I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, because we've got the ETS in place, then we're
Right.
sort of used to market-based instruments. And as Brian said, you guys over there, Brian, are still thinking about it. So yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I think to be fair, we've thought about it for a very long time, and we've had starts and stops in terms of introducing an emissions trading scheme. And as I said in my presentation, inherently in what both the government and the opposition are saying is an implication that there must be at some point an emissions trading scheme. Now, but the short-term politics of that are very, very difficult, and everybody seems rather shy about discussing it explicitly, particularly up on the run-up to the federal election, which is probably going to be in May next year. So we have this rather odd situation where implicitly we believe in market-based instruments, but outwardly it's politically difficult to discuss it. And unfortunately, that debate needs to be had, but there's enormous resistance to it. And also, as I said in my presentation, the Labor opposition is talking about a baseline and credit scheme. It says that it will introduce such a scheme should it come to power next year, and all of the legislative backing is effectively there to introduce that scheme now. So it won't be very difficult to introduce some sort of facilities-based baseline and credit scheme. It's probably one of the most inefficient emissions trading schemes in terms of design that you can think of, but it's what's there and what's easily introduced at present should there be a change of government.
You want to go? Should we go back to Hoesung? Did you want to talk about any more about that, or would you like to move on to the hydrogen question?
Right, certainly I wish to talk more about that market-based instruments, but we can discuss that at some other occasion. And hydrogen is certainly an energy carrier required, need to be considered for this goal of carbon neutrality, and each country has different circumstances to nurture this hydrogen option. So from a global perspective, we just cannot say much, only to the extent that it is certainly one of the options definitely need to be considered for carbon neutrality.
Did you want to add anything from Australia's perspective on that, Brian?
Yeah, the current government's published climate policy modelling out to 2050, and its announced plans embed a strong projected shift to hydrogen. Current costs of producing hydrogen are something like $5 to $6 per kilo, and the government has stated that its target is to see that price fall to $2 per kilo. Now, implicitly, that implies if you look at the cost of electrolyzers and assume that you're going to use renewable energy to drive those electrolyzers, that's implying that you need electricity prices somewhere around the $20 per megawatt hour to hit that sort of target. Those numbers seem pretty low, not impossible, but pretty low, particularly given the sort of capacity factors that we've got in new renewables in Australia. So the government is committed to hydrogen. It believes it's extremely important. I think its view is that we'll see hydrogen blended with natural gas in the gas pipeline system in the next 5 to 10 years as a start. But there are several billionaire entrepreneurs who are interested in producing lots of hydrogen and transforming the energy system. So I guess it's an open space, and it's a bit unclear exactly how this is going to develop at this stage.
Okay, thanks. Anybody any of
Can-
our
can I-
members want
Can
to
I
say
can I
something
make a
else?
comment there, Tony?
Yeah.
Because I think most of the hydrogen in Australia being talked about, as I understand, is brown hydrogen or even black hydrogen from gas or coal. And then you need CCS if you're going to do that, and that's not being costed in either. So it's certainly the green hydrogen, as you were alluding to, Brian, is really the only way to go. Just in New Zealand, we've just had our first hydrogen truck imported a couple of weeks ago, and there's a hydrogen refueling station up in the Port of Auckland. Where it's going to go, I'm not sure yet. We've got Balance Fertilizer Company has invested in 4 wind turbines so that they can then produce the hydrogen to make the urea. Instead of from natural gas at the moment, then it'll be green hydrogen, and that hit the headlines, but that's only about 4% of their total urea production. So it's really just a bit of greenwashing at the moment, I think. We've got our aluminium smelter owned by Rio Tinto. We've only got one, and it's very green because it's run from the Manapuri hydropower scheme. And so we're making green aluminium, if you like. But there's talk about closing that down. So all of a sudden, we've got, I think, 20% of New Zealand's electricity will become available if the smelter shuts down. And so there's talk about making hydrogen down in the Southland and exporting it to Japan or even to South Korea, I suppose, I think. And there's opportunities there, and it all sounds wonderful. Air New Zealand has got a contract with Airbus to look at hydrogen-powered planes in the future. And so there's some serious sort of work going on there. We've already got an electric plane buzzing around New Zealand the last 6 months from Slovenia, a Pipistrel. And so there's technology going both at electricity and hydrogen. And we've also got 2 or 3 hydrogen vehicles being imported as well, available. But the whole thing about hydrogen, the cost, but also the inefficiency of the whole system from an energy efficiency point of view, producing the hydrogen and then using the hydrogen. It's not the ideal case, but there will be opportunities for sure. But it's going to be a bit constrained, I think.
Yeah. Tony, can I just add something? I'm not actually sure that the lion's share of the hydrogen that's being proposed in Australia is actually brown or black, or these colour schemes are becoming a bit interesting. A lot of the proposals are actually for use of so-called excess renewables to produce green hydrogen. There are certainly proposals around to also deploy CCS. But of course, one of the problems we face in Australia is that the perfect is the enemy of the good, really, in a lot of these things. For example, there was recently a so-called method under the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is a government supported fund for producing Australian carbon credit units, to introduce a carbon capture and storage scheme. And this particular approach is now subject to a disallowance motion in the Senate. In other words, it's stalled in the Senate. So at least in the short term, our attempt to progress carbon capture and storage in Australia is held up in the Parliament.
Okay, thanks. Right, what I'm going to do is, with apologies to you, Jeff, I'm just going to jump your questions and come back to them. Sarah Fairhurst has come back with another question, and it's specifically on hydrogen and green hydrogen in Australia. She said there are some massive plans for huge solar plus wind in the Northern Territory to export hydrogen to Asia. And I think she's probably referring to the one to Singapore. is that better than the previous plan for a transmission line, but can it work? So the original plan, I never knew it changed, was for a transmission line, but she's asking, would hydrogen work?
Well, and I guess, are you directing that to me, Tony?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, yes. Yeah.
I guess whether you transmit with hydrogen or whether you transmit over a high efficiency transmission line is really an engineering question. But as has already been said, it's pretty inefficient to transform electricity into hydrogen and then transform hydrogen back into energy at the other end after transporting it on a ship. So I think that these are engineering questions that are remain open, really, but inherently the hydrogen conversion process, as we've already heard, is reasonably inefficient.
Okay, that's another one of those schemes with a billionaire involved.
Billionaire, yeah.
Yeah, billionaire. Okay, Jeff, I'm going to combine your two questions because you did say second is a follow-up. For New Zealand, in trying to meet the methane target, there are two obvious options: cut the number of cows and/or buy offshore credits. But there isn't an offshore market in methane credits as distinct from CO2 ones. Does Ralph have any ideas here? And I'll just follow up with Jeff's other question sent very shortly afterwards. In trading carbon credits, most discussion to date has been assumed substitutability among emissions on the basis of the IPCC conversion ratios, but the methane target blows that away. Markets will have to be segmented now by individual gases, ? Ralph.
Yeah, okay, so Jeff's quite right. It's not just cows, of course. We've got a few million sheep here as well, and you've got a lot more sheep over in Australia too, and it's deer. The Climate Change Commission, again, has suggested that we reduce ruminant numbers, but increase productivity of each animal. So each cow produces more milk, and this has been the case over the last 2 or 3 decades in New Zealand, that there has been improvements mainly through animal breeding and feeding, etc. But through animal breeding, animals are more productive per animal. Therefore, we need less of them. Therefore, there's less methane produced. And so, because dairy products are now our leading GDP earner, tourism was number one, but that's dropped away, Hoesung, as you may imagine. It's a key part of our economy, and so we have to tread pretty carefully there to reduce export volumes, I guess. And so, but there is a lot of discussion about moving away from animal proteins. And there's been a lot of analysis of that around the world. I've done a few projects on the future of food and energy smart farming, etc., etc. And so, we are seeing some trends. And one example is that if you go to a restaurant anywhere in New Zealand, or probably Australia or elsewhere as well, you can always get a vegetarian dish now. Maybe 5-10 years ago, that wasn't the case. So, there are social trends occurring, I think, anyway. But in order to reduce the emissions per animal, that's the real challenge. And so buying offsets offshore, as Jeff has said, is sort of a cop-out, really. We've got a New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre that was set up maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and $40 million budget, but international collaboration. And they've worked really hard on this problem for nearly a decade, I suppose. And Harry Clark, who's the head of that, is actually a climate change commissioner as well. So he's in the right place to show what's possible and what's not. So, we sort of watch this space, but we're not going to get ruminant animals emitting no methane for a long, long time.
Okay, anybody want to add to that before I go on to the next question?
Tony, can I just?
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Hoesung, you go.
All right, okay, Tony, I just have one question regarding New Zealand, and Ralph probably helps on this. Ralph indicates that the 11 years since the ETS adopted New Zealand, and the emissions have not yet declined, and that means the effectiveness about the ETS, particular to New Zealand, or would it be what lesson can we draw from that observation?
Well, I suppose you could argue if we didn't have an ETS, emissions would have risen rather than stabilized. So it's probably had some impact, but because the price has been relatively low, carbon price has been relatively low until the last year or two, then, the last year or two, then really it's not made any difference to people's behavior or change. And like I said, nobody's going to not buy the same car they would have done just because the petrol price is 15 cents a litre higher because of the carbon levy. And so I can't see that it's made a huge difference in terms of our emissions. Different industries, Jeff's much more up to speed in this on me than I am. But if the price rises, and it's talking now reaching over the next few years, there's projections of $70, $80. But Climate Change Commission, again, in its analysis, and other people have done this, Royal Society, whatever as well, 150 New Zealand dollars a tonne or above is what's needed to really make a difference. And IPCC, when the fourth assessment report, I think Mitigation Working Group 3, we were looking at $150 US a tonne in order to make some changes. So I think that probably the low price of carbon over the years is the reason why it's not been as effective as might have been hoped.
Thank you.
Brian?
Yeah, Tony, thanks. There's nothing fundamentally wrong, of course, with trading international permits to offset one's emissions. So, I mean, I don't think that's a big issue. I think the real issue here is that despite the fact that very substantial progress has been made on Article 6 at COP26, there's still a lot of details to be sorted out about the way in which permits would be traded, their source, and on what basis. It seems rather inefficient to me to introduce some sort of trading scheme and move away from the concept of a weighted set of gases. Now, there's all sorts of scientific debate, of course, about whether it's more important to do something about methane in the short term. But again, we have to be careful here that we're not going to end up with a situation where the perfect is the enemy of the good, which is often happens in the climate debate. The other thing to keep in mind is, of course, that if everybody's headed towards net zero by 2050, the price of offsets in the international market is likely to be pretty high. So there's going to be, I suspect, quite a strong incentive to do a lot of this work domestically, despite regardless of whether we end up with some sort of so-called supplementarity conditions like what we had in under the Kyoto Protocol, where effectively you were precluded from trading above a certain proportion of your domestic emissions reduction task on the international market. So there are, as I said before, we have to sort out the international rules. But we have to also keep in mind the notion that the prices of these offsets, if they're legitimate, are probably going to be pretty high as we approach 2050.
Okay, thanks.
Just to add, that's exactly the point that's being made here, is why would we spend $5 or $6 billion in buying offsets when that could really go to reducing our domestic emissions? And that's a big question that nobody's able to answer yet.
Yeah, well, that comes back to this notion about the value of exports. Are they intrinsically more valuable than doing stuff domestically? And of course, this debate is as old as humans, and I suspect is not going to go away before 2050.
Okay, final question from William Jackson, and this follows on what you've been talking about, Brian. Hydrogen is multiple times more costly than natural gas and the BTU per unit volume. Wouldn't electrical utility costs need to be multiple times higher for it to be feasible to start replacing natural gas by hydrogen?
Yeah, well, the other way of saying that, of course, is that electricity prices have to be very, very low to make this to make it feasible. And the real question is whether we're going to get to a point where the targets the Australian government have set for the price of hydrogen are actually possible, given the structure of our electricity system. And this is really going to swing on the extent to which we see investment in the transmission and distribution system to allow all of these renewables to enter the system in a reliable, sensible sort of way. And in addition to that, of course, it also swings on the implicit or explicit price of carbon. Of course, natural gas it's a fantastic commodity, but it does produce emissions. And so if we end up with a carbon price, that carbon price will help to make alternatives like hydrogen more competitive compared to what they are today.
Just a quick comment on that is that the electricity price for our aluminium smelter has been negotiated with one of our power companies, and nobody quite knows what, but it's about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So if the smelter goes offshore, people, I guess, are assuming that there's similar price for electricity would be there for hydrogen electrolysis business, but who's to know? But 3 cents a kilowatt hour is the hydro negotiated price for the smelter, and it's been very controversial, as you can imagine.
Yeah, of course. And if I might add to that, if that smelter were to go offshore, not only do you then have this electricity coming back into the system in New Zealand, which presumably is going to reduce the price of electricity, potentially at least, but you also export, if I could put it that way, the industrial gases associated with that smelter. This is certainly not green aluminium we're talking about here, if you take account of the non-CO2 emissions associated with that plant and anode effects, etc. So that is one way that New Zealand might reduce its emissions, but there are aluminium smelters elsewhere in the world that are even less efficient in terms of emissions. So this is a global problem, and we solve New Zealand's problem by giving it somebody else, in this case, potentially.
Just want to add that, build on this, Ralph and Brian's comments. I certainly this hydrogen question is a global problem, and many of the two of you mentioned these different shades of color assigned to the hydrogen, and just the fact that such an existence of different shades of color existing for the hydrogen just implies how complex of these hydrogen options will be. So that's where we stand, and every country that we review the literature. You know, there's always this issues of color coded for the hydrogen options. So that's where we are right now.
Okay, thank you. So we have to draw this to a conclusion, this webinar. Do any of our speakers want to have the final word? Last chance. No? Okay, well, thanks very much indeed for your contributions. And we'll now close it down, and it's over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Tony. IAEE wishes to thank all of you, Ralph, Hoesung, Brian, and Tony, for just an outstanding webinar. I've personally enjoyed this quite a bit. For all of you listening, this has been recorded. It will be available on our Rewind station tomorrow. And a reminder as well that IAEE will be rolling out a special issue of our energy forum on the topic of climate change. Definitely a topic that is here for the long haul, and we appreciate all of your support in addressing this issue. As we've turned the calendar to December, this is a time to also think about the holidays. And with that, I officially close this webinar and wish you all a happy holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
very
afternoon.
much. Bye.